Do you know that it's possible to understand others' thoughts using just 3 simple strategies? Let's examine what these strategies are and how they can be applied. These skills are necessary to overcome all obstacles when it becomes much easier to interpret and understand others' thoughts. Discovering how to focus on a story is developing in an ancient village where the elder brother, who is blind, spends most of his time at home, while the younger brother tends to the farming. He often noticed his fields being ravaged by wild animals. Concerned about this situation, the younger brother finally found a solution. He thought, why not keep my blind brother alert to the sounds of animals to help protect the field? After giving it some thought, the younger brother built a small hut in the field and brought his blind brother there. If you hear a suspicious sound, just shout to scare away the animals, he suggested. The elder brother accepted the proposal and began playing his role in the field. Whenever he heard an animal sound, he would shout to frighten them away. Several days passed until one day, a deer swiftly passed through the field and damaged some of the harvest, followed closely by a snake. Approaching the blind brother, the king asked if the snake had passed by. The blind man replied, "Your Majesty, I am blind. How could I see a snake? But I can assure you that it's not worth chasing after the escaping creature. You're wasting your efforts." The king was astonished by the blind man's claims. Despite being blind, he expressed an opinion about the significance of the snake. In response, the blind man said, "Your Majesty, the creature you're chasing after is, in fact, a pregnant doe. I don't recall the king ever chasing after a pregnant deer. Therefore, I believe your efforts are in vain and not worth pursuing." The king struggled to understand how the blind man determined this situation. He wondered how a person without sight could know about the condition of a deer. To verify this, he gave his command to his commander. "Capture this animal alive. If what the blind man says is true, confirm whether it is indeed pregnant." Upon his return, the commander affirmed to the king that the blind man was correct and the deer was indeed pregnant. The king was amazed at how the blind man knew the condition of the deer without seeing it. To clarify this situation, the king asked the blind brother, "I may doubt that you're truly blind, but I've come to ask you a question. Will you give me an honest answer?" In response, the blind man said, "Your Majesty, I will answer whatever you ask with complete sincerity." The king remarked, "You seem to possess extraordinary insight and a deep understanding of various matters. Today I've called you because I want to know if my wife is unfaithful to me." The blind man replied, "Your Majesty, what has prompted you to ask such a question after years of unity in your marriage? Why do you now harbor such doubts?" However, the king insisted that he must answer this question or face execution. Faced with the king's threat, the blind man expressed, "Your Majesty, to provide you with the answer you seek, I must be alone with your wife in a room." Initially hesitant, the king eventually agreed and ordered his commander to leave the blind man and the queen alone in the room. During this time, the blind man expressed his intention to make physical contact with the queen. In response to this proposal, the queen reacted vehemently. After the conflict, the blind man managed to escape and brought himself before the king. Later, the blind man informed the king, "Your Majesty, your wife is betraying you." Angered, the king drew his sword and went to the queen, warning that any lie would result in her execution. The question was about the queen's fidelity. In response, the queen said, "Your Majesty, you may take my life, but you cannot take my honor." Confirming the truth of the blind man's words, the king quickly approached him and asked how he knew about his wife's betrayal. The blind man replied, "Your Majesty, it was quite simple. I expressed my desire to touch your wife, and her reaction was so violent that she began to attack me instead of denying it, showing extreme hostility and making physical contact with me in the process. Now tell me, how could she be faithful while reacting in this manner?" Impressed by the blind man's insight, the king asked, "Are you my true son or someone else's?" In response, the blind man replied, "Your Majesty, this indeed concerns you. However, I request a promise from you that you will not react angrily before I answer." The king agreed and asked, "What is it?" In response, the blind man said, "Your Majesty, you are your father's son, but you are under the influence of an ambitious merchant." Hearing this, the king immediately turned to his mother and asked her to tell him the truth. She replied, "My son, you are indeed of your father's lineage, but you are under the influence of an ambitious merchant." Relieved, the king turned back to the blind man and asked how he knew this information. The blind man replied, "Your Majesty, I answered a few of your questions correctly, yet I have received no reward. Therefore, I concluded from your tendency toward stinginess that this must be the case." The king laughed and said, "Whatever you desire will be granted, but explain to me, how can you distinguish truth from falsehood so decisively?" The blind man responded, "Your Majesty, being blind by birth, if I had sight, I could easily understand others' thoughts by observing their facial expressions and gestures. Actions speak louder than words." The king asked, "So, can I understand others' thoughts as well?" In response, the man said, "Undoubtedly. Understanding others' thoughts involves calming your mind and focusing on the present moment. Before explaining this technique, it's essential to recognize their thoughts, especially in the current pause. To capture their thoughts, we must bring our minds back to the present moment." Continuing, he said, "Listening attentively to sounds is crucial. A person's tone can reveal a lot about what they're thinking and feeling. Notice if they speak rapidly and excitedly or slowly and calmly. Additionally, pay attention to their tone. A high and sharp tone or a low, flat tone can indicate different emotions. Furthermore, the voice can express emotions such as sighs, screams, or genuine laughter. By paying attention to how they express themselves and their tone, you can easily understand their thoughts and feelings." That's it, Your Majesty. The technique I shared today involves observing others' thoughts by observing their eyes, body language, and voice. However, remember that your mind must first focus on the current pause. If you dwell on the past or worry about the future, you will never grasp the other person's body language, and therefore, you won't understand their thoughts. Now, Your Majesty, let's move on to the next time. If you respond with a Stoic interpretation, I'll know you followed along. Now that you've chosen the Stoic path, you have 2 Stoic video options that will please you. Until our next meeting, farewell.